The Cold War was not only fought with missiles and spies, but also with silence, equations, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights in laboratories that never slept. While the world watched rockets rise toward the moon, another kind of battle unfolded in the shadows. A war for knowledge, for control, for the very secrets that made the impossible possible. In the 1960s and 70s, America was obsessed with reaching the stars. NASA's engineers became national heroes, and every launch was a symbol of triumph over communism. But behind that shining dream, paranoia quietly spread. For every new breakthrough in propulsion or satellite imaging, the question lingered in Washington's corridors. What if Moscow already knew? Inside the walls of America's most secure research centers, secrets worth entire fortunes were stored in locked filing cabinets and magnetic tapes. And within that fortress of brilliance and ambition walked a man who no one suspected, a quiet scientist, polite, precise, and invisible in plain sight. He was not driven by greed, nor by ideology alone. He was driven by something deeper, a belief that knowledge should not belong to one flag, that truth was not a matter of nationality. And through that conviction, he would become one of the most valuable spies the Soviet Union ever had. While astronauts were preparing for lunar missions, he was preparing data packages destined for Moscow. While the world cheered the triumphs of science, he was silently transferring those very triumphs to the other side of the Iron Curtain. This is the story of a man who lived between two worlds, a patriot and a traitor, a scientist and a spy, who, from the heart of NASA, helped the Soviet Union see the stars through American eyes. Because in the age of the Cold War, not all revolutions were launched from rockets. Some were carried in briefcases. In the early years of the space race, the United States gathered its brightest minds in one place: NASA. Here, science was the new battlefield, and equations were weapons of national pride. Among the quiet rows of engineers and physicists, one man blended seamlessly into the crowd, a reserved, methodical scientist named Dr. William Canton. Canton was a specialist in materials science, a field critical to the success of America's spacecraft. His work focused on thermal protection systems, the heat-resistant shields that allowed capsules to survive re-entry. Every decimal he calculated, every alloy he refined, helped bring the dream of space exploration closer to reality. But the same data that could protect an astronaut could also strengthen a Soviet missile. And that was precisely why Moscow wanted it. Outside the laboratory, Dr. Canton was a ghost. He lived alone in a small Houston apartment, kept no close friends, and spent his evenings surrounded by stacks of scientific journals and Cold War newspapers. Colleagues described him as polite but distant, a man more comfortable with machines than with people. No one suspected that, beneath his calm demeanor, he carried the burden of two loyalties, one to science, and one to an unseen power across the sea. His path to betrayal was not sudden. It began with disillusionment, the Vietnam War, political corruption, and a growing sense that truth itself had become another casualty of ideology. When Soviet operatives approached him through an academic conference in Switzerland, they didn't speak of communism. They spoke of peace, of balance, of preventing nuclear annihilation through shared knowledge. To a scientist idealist enough to believe that data could save humanity, their offer sounded less like treason and more like salvation. By the time Dr. Canton returned to Houston, the deal was already sealed. Hidden within his briefcase, among pages of thermodynamic equations, lay the beginnings of one of the most audacious acts of espionage in American history. He would soon become the invisible conduit through which the Soviet Union would peer into the beating technological heart of NASA itself. By day, Dr. William Canton was a model employee, precise, punctual, and utterly unremarkable. He arrived early at the Johnson Space Center, coffee in hand, and immersed himself in calculations that defined the cutting edge of the American space program. His supervisors trusted him implicitly. He had access to classified designs, propulsion data, and experimental composites meant for the upcoming Apollo missions. No one imagined that behind those measured eyes, a second life was quietly unfolding. At night, Canton became Orion, his codename within the KGB's scientific espionage network. In dimly lit motel rooms and shadowy cafes near Houston's outskirts, he met his handler, a Soviet diplomat stationed at the consulate in Mexico City. The meetings were carefully choreographed. A book left in a locker, a coded message slipped into the classifieds of Scientific American, a briefcase exchanged under the cover of a business seminar. Each transfer contained priceless intelligence. Data on heat-resistant ceramics, navigation algorithms, and guidance systems that could revolutionize both spacecraft and intercontinental missiles. For the KGB, Orion was a treasure. His information allowed Soviet engineers to bypass years of costly experimentation. Projects in Baikonur and Plesetsk began showing remarkable progress, matching technologies once thought exclusive to the West. Every document he delivered shifted the balance of the Cold War, bit by bit, calculation by calculation. Yet the dual existence began to corrode him from within. He lived under constant tension. Every phone ring, every unexpected knock, felt like the prelude to discovery. He spoke less at work, avoided eye contact, and began keeping meticulous records of his own paranoia. Guilt, once a distant shadow, grew into a constant companion. But even as his conscience gnawed at him, he convinced himself that he was serving humanity, not ideology, that sharing knowledge across borders was the only way to prevent mutual destruction. Each act of espionage, however, deepened the divide between the man he appeared to be and the man he was becoming. By 1971, Dr. William Canton had ceased to exist in any true sense. What remained was Orion, a brilliant ghost trapped between two superpowers, and between his ideals and his inevitable downfall. By the early 1970s, NASA had become the shining emblem of American ingenuity, a temple of science where every launch was a sermon to progress. But beneath its polished facade, invisible cracks had begun to form. Internal security units, strengthened after several suspected leaks, quietly initiated new surveillance protocols. Agents from the FBI's newly established counterintelligence division began probing deeper into the private lives of scientists and contractors, searching for anomalies hidden beneath years of routine. Among the hundreds of names that passed across their desks, one began to flicker with subtle irregularities: William Canton. Canton's brilliance had once earned him trust and access, but now it was precisely that access which drew suspicion. His travel records didn't align. His expense reports contained unaccounted gaps. A file he had supposedly archived couldn't be found, and when it was, it bore the unmistakable mark of having been copied. The clues were faint, almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet to the FBI's patient investigators they told a story. Someone inside the space program was bleeding secrets. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Cold War's intelligence web, the KGB began to grow wary. A shift in Soviet leadership had brought stricter oversight, and Moscow's center demanded results while simultaneously questioning loyalty. Orion's handler was replaced without warning, a new operative who lacked the old one's subtlety. Meetings grew tense. The signals used to arrange dead drops became inconsistent. For the first time, Canton sensed the tremors of betrayal on both sides. Sleep eluded him, His notes became incoherent, filled with fragments of equations and desperate reflections. He started noticing cars parked too long near his home, faces he thought he recognized in the corridors of NASA. Paranoia, once his professional armor, now became his enemy. Every glance felt accusatory, every colleague a potential informer. By late 1972, the FBI's dragnet had tightened around Houston. A carefully orchestrated sting was set in motion, a false drop designed to expose the mole. Canton, driven by fear and exhaustion, walked straight into the trap. Surveillance cameras recorded the moment he retrieved a microfilm canister from a dead drop site. Within minutes, unmarked cars surrounded him. When confronted, he did not resist. He merely looked down at his hands, the same hands that had shaped America's dreams of the stars, and fed them to its greatest rival. The interrogation that followed would reveal not just a spy, but a man who had long since ceased to belong anywhere. The arrest of William Canton, codename Orion, sent shockwaves through the corridors of American intelligence. Within hours, NASA's security office was sealed off, its archives frozen, and its engineers summoned for questioning under the cold glare of fluorescent lights. What had begun as a quiet investigation now erupted into a full-blown scandal that threatened to stain the very institution that had placed mankind among the stars. Canton's confession came slowly, almost reluctantly, over days of interrogation. The FBI agents expected defiance or ideological fervor, but what they encountered was exhaustion. He spoke not like a traitor defending a cause, but like a man narrating the ruins of his own conviction. He described how his recruitment had begun not with coercion, but with persuasion, how a Soviet operative posing as a European physicist had appealed to his frustration with bureaucracy, his disillusionment with American militarization, and his yearning to see science serve humanity rather than power. "I thought," he told his interrogators, "I was giving balance to the world." The depth of his betrayal, however, was staggering. Dozens of classified research files, propulsion algorithms, satellite telemetry systems, and early models of orbital defense platforms had been passed to the KGB over nearly a decade. Analysts later concluded that Soviet advancements in satellite maneuvering and atmospheric re-entry were accelerated by years due to information originating from Canton's leaks. His espionage had quietly altered the course of the space race itself. In court, he appeared pale and detached, his once confident demeanor replaced by a haunting calm. Reporters described him as a man already erased. The prosecution labeled him a national threat. The defense argued he was a visionary consumed by his own idealism. But when the verdict was read, guilty on all counts of espionage, there was no visible reaction. Only when the judge pronounced the words life imprisonment without parole did Canton close his eyes, as if finally surrendering to gravity after years spent orbiting deception. Outside the courtroom, the public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Newspapers branded him the scientist who sold the stars. But among those who had known him, colleagues, students, even rivals, there lingered a more uncomfortable truth, that Canton had once embodied the very dream he helped endanger. In trying to bridge two worlds, he had condemned himself to belong to neither. His story became a somber footnote in the long ledger of Cold War betrayals, a reminder that even in humanity's greatest pursuit of the heavens, the shadows of earthly politics could still reach all the way to the stars. In the years that followed William Canton's arrest, the corridors of NASA slowly returned to their familiar rhythm. The quiet hum of computers, the chatter of engineers, the low rumble of rocket tests echoing through the hangars. Yet beneath that surface of recovery, something irreversible had shifted. Trust, once taken for granted, had become the rarest element in the agency's atmosphere. Every scientist, no matter how brilliant, now worked under the unseen weight of suspicion. The stars still beckoned, but their light felt a little colder. The Soviet Union, for its part, never officially acknowledged Canton. His codename, Orion, appeared only once in a declassified KGB report from 1988, a single line that read, "Operational asset concluded successfully, contributions substantial." To Moscow, he had been another useful shadow in a vast machinery of secrecy. When the USSR collapsed a few years later, those same shadows dissolved into dust, leaving behind only fragments of stories, whispers of men and women who had risked everything for causes that no longer existed. Canton spent his remaining years in silence, his life reduced to the sterile routines of a federal prison. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was often about the stars. Guards would later recall how he would trace constellations on the window with his finger, as if still trying to reach the cosmos that had once defined him. In those moments, he seemed less a traitor and more a ghost, a man trapped between the infinite expanse of what could have been and the cold confines of what was. Historians would come to describe him as both villain and visionary, a paradox carved into the narrative of the Cold War. His actions accelerated the Soviet space program, but also forced the United States to tighten its security, driving technological innovation at an even faster pace. In that sense, his betrayal became a catalyst, destructive yet transformative. Today, his name is rarely mentioned in textbooks, yet his shadow lingers quietly among the archives, in the classified folders that still bear traces of his work. Somewhere between genius and guilt, between science and subversion, lies the enduring question that his story evokes. Can the pursuit of knowledge ever truly remain pure in a world divided by fear? Because in the end, the Cold War was never just about ideology or weapons or borders. It was about the fragile human heart, forever reaching for the stars, even as it's pulled down by the gravity of its own secrets.